The specialist from Zurich is pushed to Thursday, darling. Until then, we'll increase the sedative dosage. Your tremors were quite bad last night.
Imagine a world where your greatest protector is actually your silent executioner. Aurelia Storme had everything, until a tragic accident left her paralyzed and trapped in a golden cage, with only her father's protégé, Merrick Ashford, by her side. But while Merrick whispers words of love, Aurelia is starting to remember the truth. He wasn't there to save her that night. He was the one who cut the brakes. As the air in the Storme Manor grows thick with the scent of sterile antiseptic and hidden agendas, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse begins. Will Aurelia expose the monster holding her hand? Or will Merrick finish what he started before she can utter a single word? You won't want to miss a single second of this twisted betrayal. So make sure to watch until the very end to see the shocking moment the truth finally comes to light. If you love intense psychological thrillers, hit that like button right now and subscribe to join us for every chapter of this heart-pounding journey. The walls of the Storme estate had once been a symbol of heritage and pride, but now they felt like the padded boundaries of a high-end asylum. Aurelia's world had shrunk to the diameter of her wheelchair wheels, a reality enforced by Merrick Ashford with a precision that bordered on surgical. Every morning began the same way. The heavy curtains were pulled back not to let the light in, but to expose Aurelia to Marek's relentless devotion. He managed her life with the cold efficiency of a hostile takeover, dictating everything from the physical therapy sessions she was too exhausted to complete to the cocktail of recovery medications that left her mind feeling like it was wrapped in gray wool. Merrick sat across from her now, a leather-bound planner open on his lap, the ledger of her captivity. The specialist from Zurich is pushed to Thursday, darling, he murmured, his voice smooth and devoid of any real warmth. Until then, we'll increase the sedative dosage. Your tremors were quite bad last night. Aurelia wanted to scream that the tremors weren't from the injury, but from the sight of him, yet the medication kept her tongue heavy and her heart sluggish. He was erasing her, piece by piece, replacing her autonomy with his care, while her father, Caius, watched from the doorway with a gaze that grew sharper by the day. Caius Ormond was a man who had built a kingdom on intuition, and he could feel the rot in the room even if he couldn't yet name the source. She looks pale, Merrick, Caius remarked, his voice like grinding stones. Merrick didn't flinch. He simply leaned over and tucked the blanket tighter around Aurelia's legs, his fingers grazing the skin she could no longer feel. Recovery is a marathon, Caius, Merrick replied, flashing a practiced, sympathetic smile. I'm just making sure she doesn't burn out before the finish line. As Merrick stood to lead her father away to a necessary board meeting, his hand lingered on the back of Aurelia's chair, a silent reminder of who truly held the handles of her life. The cage was gilded, the bars were made of pills and promises, and for the first time, Aurelia realized that if she didn't find a way to fight through the chemical fog, Merrick wouldn't just own her father's company. He would own the very air she breathed. The afternoon sun bled through the library windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. But for Aurelia, the world remained trapped in a perpetual, hazy twilight. Merrick was gone for an hour, a rare lapse in his suffocating surveillance, leaving her in the care of a silent nurse who busied herself in the hallway. The silence of the manor was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown to a merger she could not stop. To anyone watching, she was merely a broken doll in a designer chair, but beneath the surface, the chemical fog Merrick had carefully cultivated was beginning to thin. It happened when the breeze shifted, carrying a scent from Marek's discarded blazer draped over a nearby armchair. It was a sharp, expensive aroma, sandalwood mixed with a metallic edge of ozone. Suddenly, the library walls dissolved. The smell didn't bring back the manor. It brought back the rain. Aurelia was suddenly back in the driver's seat of her car, the world spinning in a nauseating blur of shattered glass and shrieking tires. She remembered the impact, the sudden, terrifying silence of the woods, and the copper taste of blood in her mouth. In that memory, she wasn't alone. As she lay pinned against the steering wheel, unable to feel her legs, a shadow had blocked the moonlight. She remembered the door creaking open, and for a heartbeat, she had felt a surge of hope. But the person standing there hadn't called for help. They hadn't reached for their phone. Instead, that same scent of sandalwood and ozone had filled the cramped, smoke-filled cabin. The figure had leaned in, close enough for her to see the glint of a watch, and she remembered the terrifyingly calm way he had watched her struggle. His eyes devoid of anything but cold calculation. The memory flickered and sharpened. Marek's face, illuminated by the dashboard lights, looking not at her, but at his own reflection in the rearview mirror as he adjusted his tie. He had waited. He had stood in the rain, breathing in the scent of her destruction, making sure the damage was irreversible before playing the hero. A sharp gasp escaped Aurelia's lips, a sound that felt loud enough to shatter the glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing. For the first time since the accident, the phantom weight on her chest wasn't just the injury. It was the realization that her fiancé wasn't a witness to her tragedy. He was the architect of it. The flicker of the past had ignited a fire in her mind, and as the front door chimes announced Marek's return, Aurelia quickly lowered her gaze, masking the raw terror in her eyes with the blank stare of a victim. She wasn't just a patient anymore. She was a witness in hiding. The mahogany-paneled walls of Caius Ormond's private study felt like a courtroom as the billionaire CEO stood by the fireplace. A stack of high-resolution photos and a redacted police report gripped in his weathered hands. The silence was broken only by the sharp click of the door as Marek Ashford entered. His expression a mask of practiced concern that no longer reached his eyes. Caius didn't look up. His gaze was fixed on a grainy image of the brake lines from Aurelia's wreckage. Lines that looked less like they had snapped and more like they had been precisely severed. The official report says it was a mechanical failure due to poor maintenance. Marek, Caius began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed the brewing storm outside. He finally turned, his furrowed brow and glaring eyes pinning Marek to the spot. But I personally oversee the fleet. Those cars are serviced every 3 months. Yet, here I am, looking at forensic photos that suggest a surgical intervention. Tell me, how did the most secure car in my garage turn into a coffin for my daughter? Marek didn't flinch, though the air in the room seemed to thin. He took a step forward, his posture radiating the same, caring intensity he used to smother Aurelia, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the back of a chair. Caius, you're grieving. It's natural to look for a villain when there is only a tragedy, Marek replied, his tone smooth and condescendingly patient. The police closed the case. If we reopen this now, the board will see it as a sign of instability right before the merger. Is that what you want? To lose the company because of a conspiracy theory? The mention of the company, the $50 billion empire Caius had built for Aurelia's future, was a calculated strike, but it only fueled the father's fury. Caius stepped into Marek's personal space, the scent of expensive cigar smoke clashing with Marek's sandalwood cologne. Don't lecture me on stability, Caius hissed, his fingers stabbing at the report. The report says the first witness on the scene arrived 4 minutes after the crash. But the GPS logs show a mobile device, one registered to this estate, was idling at that exact coordinate 2 minutes before the 911 call was placed. Why was someone from my house watching my daughter bleed out before calling for help? Marek's eyes darkened, the perfect protege mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the methodical predator beneath. He didn't offer an excuse. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. Accusations are expensive, Caius. Without proof, they're just the ramblings of a man who's lost his grip. As Marek turned and walked out, leaving Caius trembling with a mixture of rage and burgeoning horror, the realization settled in the room like ash. The traitor wasn't at the gates. He was already sitting at the table. The heavy oak door to Aurelia's suite clicked shut, the sound echoing like a prison bolt sliding into place. Marek had just finished his nightly ritual, adjusting her pillows with that suffocating, carrying intensity and pressuring her to swallow the bitter sedative that usually plunged her into a listless stupor. But tonight, the pill rested beneath her tongue, dry and chalky, until the moment his footsteps faded down the hall. With a silent, trembling effort, she spat the medication into the folds of her silk blanket, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was alone, but she was not unobserved. The small, unblinking red eye of a security camera tucked into the molding of the ceiling watched her every move. Merrick had framed it as a safety measure for her recovery, but Aurelia knew it was the lens of her jailer. To the camera, she remained a broken, motionless figure under the moonlight. But beneath the heavy cashmere, a miracle was beginning to stir. A jagged, painful rebellion against the paralysis that Merrick had engineered. Gritting her teeth until her jaw ached, Aurelia focused every ounce of her will on her right foot. For weeks, there had been nothing but a vast, terrifying void where her lower body should be. But tonight, a spark of white-hot lightning flickered in her big toe. She squeezed her eyes shut, beads of cold sweat breaking out on her forehead as she fought the chemical fog still clinging to her brain. Move, she commanded her body. Move before he comes back. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the toe twitched. It was a tiny movement, no more than a centimeter, but to Aurelia, it felt like a seismic shift. The sensation was agonizing, like thousands of needles piercing through ice, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. It was proof that the permanent damage Merrick bragged about to her father was a lie. Her body was waking up, even as her predator tried to keep it asleep. She didn't stop there. With a ragged breath, she shifted her focus to her hand, which lay limp on the armrest. Drawing on the fury she had felt when the scent of his cologne triggered that horrific memory of the crash site, she curled her index finger, then her middle finger. The movement was jerky and weak, but it was hers. She quickly flattened her hand again, freezing in terror as she heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. She practiced the art of the blank stare, a mask of helplessness she had perfected to keep Merrick unsuspecting. When the door opened a crack and Merrick's silhouette leaned in to check on his sleeping prize, Aurelia didn't flinch. She kept her breathing shallow and her limbs leaden. He watched her for a long minute, the red light of the camera reflected in his cold, calculating eyes, before satisfied that she was still his captive doll. As the door closed again, Aurelia let out a shuddering exhale. The secret progress had begun. She was no longer just a victim waiting for a savior. She was a survivor training in the dark, preparing for the moment she would finally stand up and tear his world apart. The glass-walled boardroom of Storme International sat perched like a predator's nest above the city. But inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of an impending kill. Merrick Ashford sat at the long obsidian table, his formal attire sharp and his expression one of practiced, somber gravity. Across from him, Caius Ormond looked every bit the aging lion, his brow furrowed and his eyes glaring with a suspicion that had transitioned from a simmer to a boil. To the gathered board members, Merrick was the tragic hero, the man balancing a $50 billion merger while personally nursing the CEO's paralyzed daughter. Caius, we all respect your legacy, Merrick began, his voice a velvet strike that commanded the room's absolute attention. But the market doesn't trade on sentiment. Your recent distractions are costing the shareholders. He paused, letting the silence highlight Caius's visible exhaustion. Merrick placed a hand on the table, his Patek Philippe watch gleaming, the same watch Aurelia had glimpsed in the reign of her nightmares. The police reports, the private investigators you've hired behind the board's back. It suggests a lack of focus, a lack of stability. Merrick was moving with a methodical patience, dismantling Caius's authority just as he had dismantled Aurelia's life. He presented a series of confidential medical briefings, subtly implying that Caius's grief had spiraled into a clinical paranoia. The goal was clear. To protect the empire, the board needed a leader who wasn't compromised by family tragedy. As Merrick spoke, he wasn't just a protege anymore. He was a methodical ghost from the past, stepping out of the shadows to seize the throne. Caius slammed his hands onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. You talk of stability while you isolate my daughter? You think I don't see what you're doing, Merrick? But the outburst only played into Merrick's hands. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, seeing only a man losing his grip on reality. Merrick simply bowed his head, a masterclass in feigned hurt. I only want what's best for Aurelia, and for this company, he whispered, his tone cinematic and gritty. The stakes had never been higher. If Caius was ousted, the last line of defense between Merrick and the Storme Ormond legacy would vanish. Merrick watched his mentor struggle, a cold, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The cleaning of the house had begun, and by the time the sun set on the boardroom, the snake would no longer be hiding in the grass. He would be holding the keys to the kingdom. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a countdown to Aurelia's permanent disappearance. With Merrick still occupied at the boardroom coup and her father's presence increasingly unwelcome in her wing of the house, Aurelia found her window of opportunity. The secret progress she had made in the dark of night was now her only weapon. With a grunt of exertion that slicked her skin with cold sweat, she used her recovering right hand to drag her body toward Marek's private mahogany desk, a piece of furniture she was never supposed to reach. Her fingers, still trembling and stiff, fumbled with the locked bottom drawer. She didn't have a key, but she had observed Marek's habits with the terrifying clarity of the hunted. She reached beneath the lip of the desk, feeling for the spare magnetic key he kept tucked away for emergencies. When her fingertips finally brushed against the cold metal, a surge of adrenaline cut through her lingering chemical fog. The drawer slid open with a hushed, expensive glide, revealing a stack of files that smelled of old paper and suppressed secrets. Tucked between a property deed and a non-disclosure agreement was a plain, grease-stained envelope. It looked out of place in a room defined by clinical perfection. Aurelia's breath hitched as she pulled out a handwritten letter, the ink slightly blurred. It was from a man named Elias, a former lead mechanic at the private airfield the Stormes used. The words were a jagged confession. The payment was received, Mr. Ashford. The brake lines on the convertible were weakened exactly as discussed, enough to fail under high-speed pressure but look like a fatigue fracture to a standard inspector. I'm leaving the country as agreed. Don't contact me again. The paper crinkled in her grip as the last shard of doubt was incinerated. This was the ghost of the accident, the methodical proof that her father had been desperately searching for. Merrick hadn't just watched her bleed. He had paid to ensure she would. The letter was dated 3 days before her crash. A premeditated strike against a girl whose only crime was being the sole heir to an empire Merrick coveted. A floorboard creaked in the distance, a sound that sent a jolt of pure ice through Aurelia's veins. She could hear the heavy, confident stride of Marek's Italian leather shoes approaching the suite. Panic flared, hot and blinding, but she forced her hands to move. She shoved the letter into the waistband of her trousers, smoothing her sweater over the evidence just as the door handle began to turn. By the time Merrick stepped into the room, his eyes scanning for any sign of defiance, Aurelia was back in her chair, her face a mask of vacant, tear-streaked distress. Her heart hammered against the hidden letter, the paper a sharp reminder against her skin that the predator was now in the room with his prey. Merrick leaned over her, his hand settling on her shoulder with that familiar, suffocating weight. "Missed me, darling?" he whispered, his sandalwood scent filling her lungs like a toxin. Aurelia didn't blink. She simply stared at the window, clutching the proof of his murder attempt in the silence of her gilded cage. The heavy silence of Storme Manor was broken only by the soft, rhythmic clinking of a silver spoon against a porcelain bowl. Merrick Ashford sat on the edge of Aurelia's bed, his silhouette framed by the dim evening light, looking every bit the picture of a devoted fiancé. But his eyes, usually masked by a veneer of clinical concern, were sharp and predatory. He had noticed the way her fingers had twitched when he entered the room, a microscopic rebellion of muscle that should have been dead. The perfect patient was showing signs of a dangerous awakening, and to Merrick, an improving Aurelia was a liability he couldn't afford. "You seem restless today, my love," Merrick murmured, his voice a velvet caress that carried a hidden sting. He held out a small, crystal glass filled with a milky white liquid, a new supplement he claimed would aid her nerve regeneration. In reality, the dosage was doubled, a chemical shroud designed to pull her back into the abyss of gray wool and listless stupor. Aurelia looked at the glass, her heart hammering against the stolen letter hidden in her waistband. She knew the taste of this gift. It was the flavor of her own erasure. Caius stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed, his presence a looming shadow of suspicion that Merrick felt but refused to acknowledge. "Is that necessary, Merrick?" "She was more alert this morning," Caius noted, his voice a low rumble of paternal instinct. Merrick didn't flinch. He turned slightly, offering a pained, sympathetic smile. "Her progress is fragile, Caius. Overstimulation can lead to permanent setbacks. I'm just trying to keep her comfortable until the merger is finalized." It was a tactical lie, a cleaning house of her consciousness before he seized the empire. Aurelia felt Marek's hand settle on the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the base of her skull with a terrifyingly light touch. It was a silent ultimatum. To refuse the drink in front of her father would reveal she was more present than she had let on, potentially forcing Marek's hand before she was ready to stand. But to take it was to surrender the fragments of memory she had fought so hard to reclaim. As the glass touched her lips, the scent of his sandalwood cologne filled her lungs, a jagged reminder of the man who had watched her bleed out in the rain. She took a shallow sip, feigning a cough to spill half of it onto her chin, playing the part of the helpless victim one more time. Marek's expression darkened for a fleeting second, a flicker of the methodical monster beneath the formal attire, before he gently wiped her face with a silk handkerchief. "Easy, darling. We have all the time in the world," he whispered, though the urgency in his eyes suggested otherwise. The poisoned gift was a warning. The gilded cage was shrinking, and the predator was no longer content to wait for her to fade away. The grand ballroom of the Storme estate was a sea of shimmering silk and cold, calculated smiles, a cinematic display of power designed to mask the rot beneath the surface. Crystal chandeliers cast a fractured light over the elite of the business world, gathered to witness the finalization of the $50 billion merger. For Merrick Ashford, this was the climax of his patient, methodical takeover. For Aurelia, it was the final stage of her gilded imprisonment. She sat in her wheelchair at the center of the room, a silent, fragile centerpiece draped in midnight blue, while Merrick stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder with the proprietary weight of a conqueror. The atmosphere was tense, shifting from a celebratory atmosphere to an urgent tactical thriller as the night progressed. Every time a guest approached to offer hollow sympathies, Merrick leaned in, his sandalwood scent mixing with the expensive champagne, whispering loving updates on her condition that were nothing more than verbal shackles. He was the devoted protector, the man who had supposedly saved the billionaire CEO's daughter. Yet the glare in Caius Ormond's eyes from across the room suggested the cleaning house had already begun. Caius moved through the crowd like a cornered lion, his brow furrowed as he evaluated the circle of traitors surrounding his legacy. Beneath her blanket, Aurelia felt the sharp edge of the mechanic's letter against her skin, the evidence that Tony Duca, or perhaps a closer ghost, had tampered with her life. Her right hand, hidden from the unblinking eyes of the security cameras, gripped the armrest with a strength that would have terrified Merrick if he dared to look down. She watched him charm the board members, his Patek Philippe watch gleaming as he gestured toward the horizon of their new empire, oblivious to the fact that his prey was no longer paralyzed by fear. The pacing of the evening accelerated as the time for the formal signing approached. Merrick leaned down, his lips brushing Aurelia's ear. "Smile, darling," he hissed, his voice a low, gritty threat. "After tonight, you'll never have to worry about anything again." The stakes were absolute. If she didn't act now, she would lose her life, her father's organization, and her entire legacy to the man who had watched her bleed. As the music swelled and the spotlight shifted toward the podium, Aurelia took a ragged breath, preparing to shatter the atmospheric mystery of her silence and trigger a freight train of realizations for everyone in the room. The ballroom fell into a practiced, expectant silence as Merrick Ashford stepped toward the podium, his hand finally releasing Aurelia's shoulder to adjust the microphone. This was the climax of his patient, methodical takeover, the moment the $50 billion merger would be signed, effectively dismantling Caius Ormond's control and cementing Marek's legacy. He looked out at the sea of elite faces, his expression one of cinematic gravity, playing the part of the grieving fiancé and brilliant strategist to perfection. This merger isn't just about business, Marek's voice echoed, smooth and velvet. It's about the future, a future I have dedicated myself to protecting, alongside Aurelia. Beside him, Aurelia felt a freight train of realizations and adrenaline surging through her. The atmospheric mystery of her silence was about to shatter. As Marek reached for the gold pen, his Patek Philippe watch gleaming under the chandeliers, Aurelia didn't look at the board members or the cameras. She looked at her father, whose brow was furrowed with a mixture of rage and burgeoning hope. With a ragged, audible breath that cut through Marek's speech, Aurelia did the one thing no one in the room thought possible. She moved. Her right hand, no longer limp, gripped the armrest of the wheelchair with white-knuckled intensity. Gritting her teeth against the needles of pain, she forced her legs to obey a command they had ignored for months. The room gasped as the paralyzed heiress rose, trembling but upright, shedding her heavy cashmere blanket like a ghost shedding its shroud. Marek froze, his perfect protégé mask slipping to reveal a look of pure, methodical terror. The only thing Marek Ashford has protected, Aurelia's voice rang out, raw and clear, is the secret of how he tried to kill me. Before Marek could move, she threw the grease-stained letter from the mechanic onto the podium. He didn't save me from the crash. He was the architect of it. He cut the brakes, and he watched me bleed so he could sit in that chair. The outcome was an immediate transformation of the room's power dynamic. Caius Ormond didn't wait for a signal. He moved with the speed of a man whose emotional armor had finally cracked, stepping between his daughter and the predator. Security swarmed as Marek realized his circle of traitors could no longer save him. The cleaning house had truly begun, but it wasn't Silvio's organization being dismantled. It was Marek's web of lies. Aurelia stood tall, her physical recovery a testament to her inner strength, proving that while Marek had broken her body, he had never touched her soul. She had found her path to redemption, not through fear, but through the cold, hard light of the truth.